Welcome and thank you so much for coming. Everybody, you can hear me okay? Okay, good. And so many wonderful faces and names that I'm seeing on this screen, and I wish we could all be together in person. That would make this even better. But I'm so pleased to have the chance to honor Wendell Mayo, who tragically passed last year, but he left us with some wonderful writing. And so tonight we're reading from his newest book, What Is Said About Elephants, which just came out with Unsolicited Press, I believe the end of last month. So throughout the reading, I'll post a link to the website where you can purchase a copy directly from the press. I think I'm putting it in there right now. And I think you can order it on all the likely suspects for online book ordering as well, but it's always great if you can get it from the press. And I should mention, this book is fantastic and beautiful and funny, and you'll get to hear a good amount of it, a good amount as we read excerpts from it tonight. But also, all profits from this title will be donated to the Friendship Animal Protective League of Lorain County as a way to honor the legacy of Wendell Mayo. So that's not yet another reason to purchase the book if you are able. Okay, so what we're going to be doing tonight is 6 of us, former students of Wendell Mayo's, will be reading selections from his work. Sorry, I'm kind of letting folks in while I also MC here. So it'll be me, in this order, me, and then Bess Winter, Brad Felver, Anne Valente, Misha Rai, and Matt Bell. And we'll go for probably a little under an hour here, and then again, we'll have a little bit of time at the end. We're each gonna read an excerpt and then share, a little bit of a memory or just an excerpt, whatever the wonderful readers would like to do. And I'll be introducing folks as we go through this. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started with my part. Since I helped coordinate this, I took advantage of choosing the order, which I always want to go first because I am a ball of anxiety. And that's another thing I like about Zoom is it's easier to manage that. Okay, so here's my bio in case you don't know who I am. I'm Dustin Hoffman, Dustin M. Hoffman. I graduated from BGSU's MFA program in fiction in 2009. And that's after I spent a decade painting houses in Michigan. I now teach at Winthrop University in South Carolina. I have 2 story collections out, 100 Knuckle Fist and No Good for Digging, and a chapbook of fiction called Secrets of the Wild. And I couldn't have written any of these books without Wendell, my wonderful mentor. And No Good for Digging is actually dedicated to him. Oh, I should read Wendell's bio too from his book for those of you who might not be familiar with Wendell Mayo. I think a lot of us are, but I think some folks are know some of the writers here and join for that. So you're in for a treat getting introduced to Wendell. Well, Wendell Mayo was a native of Corpus Christi, Texas. He authored 5 collections of short stories, recently Survival House. His other collections are The Cucumber King of Cadania, Centaur of the North, Bee Horror and Other Stories, my personal favorite, and a novel and stories in Lithuanian Wood. Over 100 of his short stories have appeared widely in magazines and anthologies, including Yale Review, Harvard Review, Missouri Review, Boulevard, New Letters, Threepenny, Indiana Review. Like everywhere you want to be published, Wendell was published. He received the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship, a Fulbright to Lithuania, 2 Individual Excellence Awards from the Ohio Arts Council, and a Master Fellowship from the Indiana Arts Commission. He taught fiction writing in the MFA, BFA programs at Bowling Green State University for over 20 years. Okay, so that's Wendell. And now, even better than his impressive bio, I get to read a little bit of his work. And you can all still hear me, okay? Still getting used to like the void, right? Okay, so this is, I thought we'd start with something funny. I think this is really funny in the brutally awkward, painful sense of humor that Wendell was so good at doing and that I love so much. And it's, of course, the language is just gorgeous too. So the main character in this is named Moody, and this is the beginning of the Ponce de Leon Senior Therapy Swim. Moody limps from parking lot to main entrance. Before he can recall taking his daily doses of new statins, of cholesterol and osteobuttress, swish go the doors, a little wet smooch trailing. He stops, waits, looks about, thinks the doors stand agape for someone else, then realizes they stand gaping for him. Just him, only him, and he inches ahead, enveloped in dank primeval warmth, a swirling atmospheric soup like the dawn of time. He gags on chlorine, feels swept along in a swill of procreative chemicals like the first single-cell organism in creation, jiggling cilia to move forward, close along one wall, into the steamy senior men's locker room until he confronts a tract of olive drab slime growing in the grout of a tile. Moody recoils, fearing he may contract MRSA on top of the torn meniscus in his left knee, the result of a 16-year-old's jumping low-line sidekick in the martial arts class Moody enrolled in at age 60. The injury, Moody's fault. Part of the dojo creed. You get hurt, it's your fault. Everything is your fault, all the time. Another spasm of pain ripples from his knee to groin, so Moody ventures farther into the locker room until the fog begins to part, slowly peeling away eons of anticipation in seconds, and at last he encounters 3 monstrous figures in dim drizzle, old men sitting on benches, buck naked, sagging, puckered ass cracks galore, all in various stages of dragging on swim trunks in terrifying slow motion. One has an 8-inch incision running vertically along his spine, scars of suture blooming like tiny violets on either side of the wound. The man rises, snugs his trunks with a sound like a little gasp, and shish-shushes baby steps toward the exit to the pool. Then a second senior brushes slowly past Moody, examining him on his way out with one raised bushy eyebrow sprouting a stiff wild hair above the others. The third man has thoroughly tangled his street pants and swim trunks about his ankles. He rises and faces Moody, swings his old, wrinkled, pendulous dong square in Moody's view, and pleads with his eyes, no effort of human speech, just pleads silently as if Moody is his Paleolithic manservant. Moody goes over and tries to untangle the man's pants and trunks. Too big, floppy, printed with little pimply howdy-doody faces. He realizes he can't unknot the man's tangled trunks unless he kneels, the old man's dong hanging just at his forehead. After Moody leaves Old Tangled Pants diddling with his trunk's tie string, he changes in a modestly secluded area of the locker room, then exits through another set of wet smooching doors. And there it is, the Ponce de Leon, what passes for a fountain of youth, gold paint trimming the perimeter of the rectangular pool, chest-high water, a vague plume of antediluvian mist rising from the surface, a rousing scent of fecundity, if not for the gray heads lumbering at random through the sloshing, virescent liquid, looking like survivors of a shipwreck. A teenage girl, the lifeguard, perches above all, like an angel, divining who will be saved from the marine calamity and who will not. So that's the intro of one of my favorite stories in that collection. And again, just such a wonderful sense of humor. And now I'm going to just briefly read a little thing I wrote, a memory of Wendell, a little bit I wanted to say about him, and then we'll go on to Bess from here. So sometimes I wonder what Wendell could have possibly seen in my train wreck of a writing sample when I applied to BGSU, but he saw something. Later, I'd come to realize that Wendell was a story whisperer, so I suppose he could divine potential out of scraps. He could identify a true artist from a sentence, I think, I hope, and after he read your story and marked it up with his astronaut pen in extensive, loving, challenging line comments, you knew he got you. Before Wendell passed, we'd been emailing about future collaborations after I convinced him to co-author an essay about endings with me. I'd called him a story whisperer, and he suggested we write another essay saying, and this is a quote from an email I pulled from Wendell, I mean, most good CW teachers have a way of reading inside the mind of a story, coaxing it out of reticence, finding out what's bugging it. Maybe we could share some thoughts and approaches to story whispering. Wendell was that for me, and I'm deeply sorry I won't get to collaborate with him again, one of the greatest honors of my professional life. But thanks to Wendell, I found my voice. He brought out my weird, he encouraged my stories about working people, but actually, every other writing teacher encouraged me to write about the construction workers I'd spent a decade laboring beside. Where this was a surprising perspective to others, to Wendell, it was naturally good material. No surprise to him. What Wendell gave me then was the voice I needed to get these stories right. A voice that was playful and weird and could be funny and painful at once. His work always struck me with this perfect balance. I read his collection, B Horror, the summer before starting my MFA, and it blew me away. These were the types of stories I've been looking for, funny and horrific and working class and so formally ingenious. I adored the book so much, and because I was poor then, I bought a used copy, a former library one, and I was embarrassed by that, but Wendell still signed it for me a year later. This was what he wrote inside. For Dustin, the consummate writer, defender of truth, justice, and the artist's way. And don't tell me if you wrote that in your book too. I don't want to, that might have been his line. It was nice he could say these things to a 27-year-old barely figuring out how to write. But these words are better turned back around on their author, Wendell, the consummate writer, defender of truth, justice, and the artist's way. That was our man, our mentor, my friend. All right. I'm gonna move us along to Bess here. So this is Bess's bio. And this is like, we were commenting on this, the readers over our email chain of like what impressive bios everyone has, which again is a testament to the BGSU program, to Wendell, and Lawrence is here tonight as well. So thank you everybody associated with that program. Bess Winter is a Canadian-American writer. Her work appears in American Short Fiction, the Cincinnati Review, the Gettysburg Review, Alaska Quarterly Review, Norton's Flash Fiction International, as well as the 2013 Pushcart Prize Anthology. She holds an MFA from Bowling Green State University, from which she graduated in 2011, and a PhD from University of Cincinnati. She is an assistant professor of English at Eastern Illinois University. Her book, Machines of Another Era, will be published by Goldwake Press in January. And Bess, please take it away.
Thanks, Dustin. It's hard to follow on that really loving tribute that you did to Wendell. But thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, because Wendell was so important to me and I think all of our development as a writer and a lot of the people who are watching this tonight. So I'm going to read two pieces from this book. The first is the title story, which is quite short. And then I'm going to read some selections from a longer story. So this story is What is Said About Elephants. Because you promised Soledad many times to go with her to the zoo, but never went, you visit her elephants, using the senior discount card she'd gotten for you both, though she'd only used it once before liver dialysis, jaundiced eyes, before her passing on. Now a cold, ochreous morning sky follows you all the way to the Tembo Trail, where alone you lean on the icy railing, not sure the elephants will be out, though evidence abounds. Elephant snot and mud-smeared plexiglass, the scent of elephant dung that makes you woozy. But there's no sign of them, just mounds of sand and 3 tall telephone poles rising out of the frozen ground, fitted with steel I-beams resembling ribs of an umbrella, over which a dense khaki netting is fastened, dimly reminiscent of fever trees of the savannah, their dusty yellow bark, stark silhouettes against a saffron sky, a young Soledad at your side, alive. You hardly have time to choke back rising grief, to push away from the rail and start home, when Beasley, the trainer, so it says on his name tag, leans in at your elbow like a walking stick, waiting as young people sometimes wait for recognition. I don't see any elephants, you grumble with bilious disinterest. Beasley leaves mercifully. Again, you push from the rail to go home. Then notice on your right a hole in a stucco portion of the barrier, a feeding portal, a hinged wire screen covering it. You hear the rumble of elephant steps stopping on just the other side. You look through the portal, can just make out the mountainous slope of the animal's derriere and its tail whipping back and forth. Then Beasley reappears right at your elbow. There you go, mister, he says. Meet Victoria. You hear Victoria swat her side of the portal with her trunk like a major leaguer. How can I meet her if I can't really see her, you ask? Right, Beasley smiles. Come, Vicky. Victoria lumbers into full side view, just inches behind the plexiglass, too much to take in all at once. So you fix your gaze on her tiny yellow eye at the vortex of her gray, wrinkled sea of swirling flesh, rippled folds of skin that draw you inward to a yellow center in which there is no memory of Soledad's jaundice, only a pulsing in your neck, the vaguest sound of Victoria snuffling at frozen ground, a swish of air, a throb like distant thunder, fever trees, sounds muttered more than meant, the color yellow, and no other yellow before the everlasting yellow in the eye of the elephant. It's said, Beasley says, an elephant won't pass by a dead elephant without casting a branch or some dust on the body. A kind of homage, I suppose. You turn to Beasley. Kid, you say, what else can you tell me about elephants? So that's a very short piece. And then I'm going to read from a longer story, which I really love in here, called Darnell's Garden. And part of the reason I love this is because Wendell was so encouraging of stories with conceits. He loved whimsical conceits and he would really play with them himself. And he is playing with a real conceit here, and he also manages to really roast academics. So I'm definitely going to read that part where he roasts academics. So, his mother's garden had not been cared for in 5 seasons. 5 seasons since Mrs. Darnell began, quite understandably, to neglect it. Before that, the garden was much more than Mrs. Darnell's garden. It drew the attention of the Shakespeare Society of Santa Cruz, whose president was Miss Ruth Jeanette, a hairstylist. The board of trustees was comprised of Mr. Wilson Charles, a bank vice president with Security Pacific, Dr. Michael Minton, a geneticist, Mr. Otto Orgavan, a minor poet of growing reputation, and Dr. Jane Smith Smythe, a corresponding member and professor of English at the Orange County Community College. Mrs. Darnell had never joined the society. She started and kept the garden out of private interest in Shakespeare and frequently consulted with one Mr. Rasselas of the Rasselas Greenhouse about its care and upkeep. She gradually opened the garden to the Shakespeare Society of Santa Cruz for various social functions and dramatic readings. Darnell phoned Mr. Rasselas to see if he might locate a sweet majoram plant for the elder Mrs. Darnell. I'm sure I won't have any sweet majoram, Mr. Rasselas replied. Say, his voice rose an octave. You going to do anything with your mother's garden? I'm not sure, Darnell told him. I'm not sure where to begin. Rasselas made Darnell promise to call him if he needed any help with the garden, then added he'd tried to locate the sweet majoram at a supplier in Sausalito. Darnell was surprised when Rasselas showed up an hour later at his doorstep. He was a tall man with thick eyebrows that grew together across the bridge of his nose. His skin was pale, slightly greenish. He wore a khaki jumpsuit with a white tag embroidered on the breast. The tag read, Rasselas, in bright red thread. You know, I haven't been over here for years, he said. I was just now driving home from work, and I was curious about what you might be doing with the garden. You mind if I have a look? Rasselas went directly to the back patio door and out to the garden. You may not be looking for advice, he said with his hands on his hips, but I'd clear that honeysuckle right away and move those planters of pinks and primrose so the morning light can get at them. See over there, about 8 o'clock On the brick walk, that's where you ought to set them. Dig out the rest of the honeysuckle there, or they'll be crawling all over them. Then you can run rows of the lilies however you please. They don't mind the shade. Of course, these herbs, they'll take as much light as you can give them. They're good right there at the heart of things. Rasselas walked to the far end of the garden and stood at the 12 o'clock position on the circular brick walk. He pushed his way through the honeysuckle, then turned to face Darnell, who struggled to keep up with the determined gardener. Rasselas stripped several honeysuckle runners from an area to his right and presented Darnell with the bronze, heavily oxidized bust of a thin, balding man with a sharply pointed beard. Here he is, Mr. Shakespeare. The bust was a very thin version of the bard, and one that endowed him with tufts of well-defined curls about the ears. It looked rather like Abraham Lincoln, not the other cherubic, limp-haired renderings Darnell remembered. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and different members of the Shakespeare Society have been visiting Darnell and trying to tell him how to plant his garden. Later that week, the sweet marjoram arrived, and Darnell drove out to Rasselas's greenhouse to pick it up. The way back, he visited his mother. He often derived a great measure of joy at her physical stamina. He asked her, "How would you like the garden? What shall I do with it?" She reached out and placed her thin fingers on both sides of his face. Her face was bright, as if lit from behind. She spoke softly and with a lucidity that startled him. "Sleep thou, and I will wind thee in my arms. So doth the woodbine the sweet honeysuckle gently entwist. The female ivy so enrings the barky fingers of the elm. Oh, how I love thee, how I dote on thee." He handed her a sprig of sweet marjoram, kissed her forehead, and left. The remaining drive home, Darnell made up his mind to sort through the various plans presented by Mr. Rasselas and other members of the Shakespeare Society of Santa Cruz. His thoughts began to poke and stab at the problem, but he drew a blank. The coast road was treacherous, even with his bifocals, so he concentrated on his driving. When he arrived, he gathered his mail and walked to the patio. He found a letter from Professor Smith-Smythe. "Dear Mr. Darnell, Mr. Orgavon has written to me and described your problem. Although Mr. Orgavon can, I fear, be rather gloomy about your prospects for a garden claiming to be Shakespeare's, it seems to me that he is correct in his assumption that the claim of your garden to be the author's is absurd. But one cannot deny the existence of the garden, so let me hold forth some hope. I would suggest that you begin with one flower or plant and locate each in such a way that each additional flower highlights the difference between them. In fact, between plants, groups of plants, or whole sections of flora. Do not worry about an essential pattern. The placement of the plants as they resonate with their direct allusions in the text of Shakespeare will be a tissue of contradictions, such as in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Even something as simple as a primrose may at once exhibit qualities of primrose and not primrose. Given such a tissue of contradictions, differences, the pleasure a viewer might take in the garden might be stated thus. The essential apprehension of the pattern will be endlessly deferred. The garden will itself unveil a significant lack of unveiling, that the truth itself about Shakespeare and his plays is always hidden, happily. Let me know if you have any questions or need further clarification. Kind regards, Dr. James Smith-Smythe." So I will leave it at that. And in terms of my sharing a memory of Wendell, Dustin hit so many things on the head when he was talking about how he helped us form our voices. But we also, before everybody got here, were talking about how many of our memories of Wendell are entwined with food. And he always had food. He would bring food to workshop. He made pickles. And because we were poor, we were grad students, and workshop was at dinner time, I often would eat beef jerky, which was probably really stinky and annoying for other people in the workshop. But it was, you could get it out of the out of the vending machine at East Hall. And one time we were flying to AWP, and I think we were flying to Denver that year, and Wendell was on the same flight as me. but I didn't know that he was seated in the seat in front of me. And I was sitting on the plane thinking, gosh, I'm really hungry, but there's no food here. When will they come around with the nuts? And Wendell turned around and he had a big meat stick. He was like, I thought you might be hungry. And that just seems very Wendell to me. Like he was very, very nurturing and not judgmental at all, even of our strange tastes in both fiction and food. So I always think of Wendell when I eat beef jerky now.
All right, thank you so much, Bess. And by the way, I have some Wendell books back here, but this is B Horror, which I thought always had the most horrifying cover ever. It so disturbed me. And anyway, thanks, Bess, for that wonderful reading and for sharing that memory. And on to Brad Felver. So here's Brad's bio. Brad Felver came to Bowling Green in 2009 specifically to study with Wendell Mayo. His fiction and essays have appeared in One Story, New England Review, Colorado Review, and many others. He's been honored with an O. Henry Award, an Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Award, and a fellowship to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. His debut story collection, The Dogs of Detroit, won the Drew Heinz Literature Prize. It's a great collection. He lives in Toledo, Ohio, with his wife and 2 sons. And so, Brad, please take it away.
Hey, how is everyone? Thanks. Dustin, thanks for organizing all of this. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I'm going to start with my Wendell story, I think, if only because I'm not sure I will get it out otherwise if I have to just sit here with it the whole time. But it's kind of a stitching together of 2 different episodes, and it's been running through my head for a while, and I've been thinking about, all right, Wendell, what did he always say about repetition and variation? And like, I remember one time when we were in workshop, he made some awful metaphor about needle and thread, and I don't know if people remember that, but we roasted him for it, and he was really good-natured about it. And anyway, so what I keep coming back to is the notion that, I came to Bowling Green because I read In Lithuanian Wood, and I wanted to study with Wendell, and it was really that simple for me. I never expected that I would then stay at Bowling Green and teach there for the next 10 years. And so I feel tremendously grateful that I got so many more years with a mentor like Wendell than I frankly ever deserved, than I ever planned on. And to kind of have that relationship evolve over the years, it was a really cool thing. And one time I remember sitting in my office and Wendell kind of came like stomping in as he did that sort of Wendell entry into a room, and he could see something was wrong, that I was just having a rough day. I don't know what it was. And he asked what was going on. I said, I'm just having one of those days where I could use a hug. And I didn't mean anything by it. It was kind of an innocuous comment. And here he comes bounding across my office, just wrapping me up in a big Wendell bear hug before I could even get up. And he knew that I wasn't really asking for a hug, but he kind of got the moment. And then we went out to lunch about a month before he died, and he had retired kind of unexpectedly the year before. And I'd been thinking a lot about how different BGSU felt without Wendell there. I didn't quite realize that he was such a center of gravity for me, but he clearly was. And it was just great to see him. It was great to talk to him about BGSU, but about family and writing and stuff like that. And he kind of had this calming presence on me, as he always did. And what I remember most is that I got to have a really good goodbye. We stood out in the parking lot, and he gave me another great big Wendell bear hug, and that was the last time I ever saw him. And I'm very grateful for that. So that's why I'm telling the story first. I'm going to read a little bit from one of the stories that I particularly love in this collection. It's called His Mother from a Great Distance. And it's a story that oscillates point of view between a mother who's flying to see her son, and then the son who's kind of waiting for mom to show up. I'm only going to read the first handful of sections just from the mother's perspective, just because it doesn't work for time's sake. But we're missing out on some of the really excellent kind of dramatic irony and some of the other, things that Wendell's doing here. So FYI, it's better, if you read the whole thing. His mother from a great distance. Out of her element, Never flown in her life. Yet she sets off for the international terminal in Houston, tows a small brown suitcase with tiny brass wheels, clickety-clacking over metal strips and composite flooring, pink magnolia printed dress tightly about her hips, index toes piggyback over big toes that poke out ends of two small sandals, toenails spackled with deep red, chipped and sheenless polish, mouth in a tight line of determination, tongue swiping her lower lip, gulping for air. My foot, she huffs when the TSA man asks her to remove her sandals. His stern look, the one she knows well. So she complies with a fish grin, swims for the gate as if upstream. Stops to ask 3 different people for directions, boards the plane, argues with a white-haired, paisley-tied businessman about which number and letter correspond to the window or aisle seat, which in the long run becomes irrelevant because a gallant college exchange student surrenders his window seat to her. She snaps her seatbelt buckle into place, asks the young man, how far to Vilnius? She'll try every gadget for sure. 30 minutes after takeoff, she untangles the cord of the audio headset, and after pressing all the buttons on the armrest and overhead, after 2 trips by the steward to her seat to ask, do you need anything, ma'am? And to switch off the call button, she breaks out her complimentary flight kit, requiring the college exchange student to step into the aisle while she wriggles, apologetically, to unbuckle her seatbelt. Then, wedging the gray plastic complimentary shoehorn beneath the heel of her excruciatingly constrictive sandals, pops them off, one by one, slips on her complimentary transatlantic comfort socks, and as the student tries to reseat himself, gallantly of course, she removes the minuscule bottle of body lotion and massages it into every square centimeter of exposed epidermis until the contents are gone. Then she places the sleeping blindfold over her eyes, settles back, wrings her hands slowly, like small pectoral fins sculling water. It's just like her to speak with perfect strangers. By the time they leave the east coast of the US, over to the North Atlantic, she raises her blindfold above her eyes, brushes her teeth with a complimentary toothpaste and 2-part breakaway toothbrush, spits the gooey residue of saliva and spent paste into her bag reserved for air sickness. The in-flight feature movie begins and she speaks straight into the liquid, greenish, fluorescent darkness, turning time to time to see that the gallant college exchange student listens. She says, it would be just like my son to go to Lithuania. It's bad enough once you take the babies off your nipple, you start to lose them. But my son was allergic to my milk, hated the stuff. His eyes swelled shut. He could hardly breathe. He'd bawl and bawl for days. And so only after 4 weeks, pop, he came right off my breast. You see, too soon. And now he thinks it damaged him. And you combine that with his father never telling him he believed in God and dying so young, well, it's no wonder he turned out to be a writer. My son says writers are damaged. One time he thanked me for damaging him. It's like her to never leave out anything. She says, now that he's supposed to be grown up, if I even try to get within 100 miles of him, kilometers, whatever, he gets nervous and acts like all he has all these big shot things to do. I ask him on the telephone, are you staying away from milk, cheese, stuff like that? But he says, so what if I'm not? But I say, you're crazy, and get real mad at him. But then I calm down because I remember right after his father died, I caught him in the bathroom, standing at the mirror, holding a Boy Scout knife to his throat. I said, what in God's name are you doing? What do you care, he replied, shutting the door and leaning against it with his smart-ass lean. But he doesn't know how strong I am, especially when I bring my elbows in, knees together, and lunge with my forearms. I pushed as hard as I could. I asked God to help me, and the door flew open, and I took that knife from him and stuck it even tighter against his throat. You want to die? I screamed. You try those shenanigans again, and I'll kill you myself. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Brett. That was great. At the halfway point, I thought I'd just post the link again to Wendell's book or with the press. And next up, we have Anne Valente. So Anne Valente is a 2010 MFA graduate of Bowling Green State University. She is the author of 2 novels, Our Hearts Will Burn Us Down and The Desert Sky Before Us, both published by William Morrow HarperCollins, and a short story collection, By Light We Knew Our Names, which won the Dzanc Fiction Prize. Her short stories appear in American Short Fiction, One Story, the Kenyon Review, and the Chicago Tribune. Originally from St. Louis, she lives in upstate New York, where she teaches creative writing at Hamilton College. All right, Anne, please.
Thank you, Dustin, for the introduction and also just for organizing this. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, just to celebrate Wendell and Wendell's work and this book with all of you. So it's a real pleasure to be here. What I'm going to read is just the ending to the story, When the Moon Was Ours for the Taking. And the reason, well, I'll share my memory, I guess, after I read this, but I just want to read the final scene in order to contextualize this story if you have not yet read the collection. So this is a story about a family fishing trip. It's told from the point of view of a boy whose father works for NASA. It's set in 1967. And just to contextualize it just a bit, I lied, I will not read just the ending. I'm just gonna read the first paragraph to contextualize the voice of this for you. And then I will fast forward to the ending. But the story begins. There's no photographic evidence we ever made the trip. Still, I can picture you. May 1967, a pale afternoon moon in the sky, the way its ghost hangs overhead reminding me it's always there. You're snapping new car top carriers onto chrome strips of our Ford Galaxy. A red and white fishing spoon hangs just above your ear, planted in your khaki ball cap by one barb of its treble hook. The other two barbs dangle, dangerously exposed. Mom calls to you through the screen door facing the driveway and Galaxy. About ready for your penance, penance I say and look at you. Think guilt, penitentiary, she replies. Your father's doing his time. So the premise of this story is that this father does not spend a lot of time with his family because he is hard at work at NASA and very busy, but that this trip is sort of structured as his guilt for not spending much time with his child. So from that beginning bit that I read, the story then transitions into present tense, and the entire story is told in present tense. And so I'm going to pick back up just in this last scene, which shifts back into past tense, told retrospectively, much like the first line. Father, I'm sorry, I should say just briefly, to contextualize, I apologize, this very last scene. So I should say on this fishing trip that not a lot happens. They're intending to go fishing and they try to go catch this enormous pike and they're just about to do so, and then the pike disappears. They don't catch it, and then the father asks the son to cut the line so they can just go home. And the son sort of plays around with the knife and says he's not going to cut the line. So this is where we leave off. Father, I cut the line from you that day, filament by filament. And when you were free, I feared you might fly up and remain a speck on the laughing face of the afternoon moon, and you didn't, at least for a while. When you and I returned fishless, Mom came over and sat next to me on the log couch by the campfire. I told her the story of how I'd captured you on La Roche Bay. She gently pressed a finger to my forehead and whispered, remember. That time, not a warning, but a reminder to not forget. Later that evening, I watched sparks from our campfire sail up to the moon. You and Mom looked up at the night sky so long, I thought your necks might lock in place. The moon's right there for the taking, you said. Who would have guessed that only 2 years later we would take the moon, and later, within lifetimes of you and Mom, choose not to return. I know what you might think of me, so many years later writing down events of our first and last adventure far north, as if they are happening now. Not one photograph to rely on, writing, line by line, filament by filament. Only now trying to understand your love of distant places. You might say I've built a rocket fast enough to travel back in time to relive those moments. You might say how implausible, how terribly unscientific. And you'd be right. I have my penance too. These days, I'm no longer interested in the moon's vast sea of tranquility, the historic spot the eagle touched down. I don't explore the moon's greater oceans of rock and dust. Instead, I chart its lesser bodies. Lucus solitudinus, lake of solitude. Lucus temporis, lake of time. Lucus sonorium, lake of dreams. Each of these reminds me of some ancient, milder calamity, each crater formed by a smaller meteor, our meteor, coming from an unimaginable distance, each a memento of that moment I thought I had you right where I wanted you, each a chance collision of matter in a far-off place. So I picked this story, and in part the memory that I want to share, just because one of the things that I remember about Wendell the most, and that I think I've repeated often to people, is just what he said about endings. So I think it's fitting, Dustin, that you mentioned earlier that you were going to write an article with him about endings, because this is what I remember. The thing that he told me, and perhaps he told our entire class, is that when you end a story, you want, for him, he said that when he ends a story, he knows it's the right ending because he feels the hair stand up on the back of his neck. And I remembered that always, and I've taken that with me, not because that happens to me, but because of the connection that he drew between the body and the word. And I've looked for that in every writing and every ending that I have written since then, for that visceral reaction of what it means for me to know that I've reached the right language on that ending. And I guess before I finish up, the only other thing I want to say about Wendell as well, beyond the writing advice and the things that I took away from his class, other than just that I didn't know how to write, I hadn't written anything when I got to Bowling Green, and he and Lawrence and the program made me the writer that I am, but that and just thinking about how he structured the classroom, it just occurs to me, and thinking about him now, that I pretty much teach the way that he taught. He was sort of a model for what I want in my classrooms. He just brought a lot of wonder. He brought a lot of curiosity in the classroom. And I can't say that my students would say that about my classes, but that's what I hope for them, that they come away with some curiosity and wonder, and that he really just brought into the room that we could teach him something too. And also just that we were all part of a community. I think the testament of everyone here tonight is that he really fostered student trust amongst each other, and created this amazing family of people whom still mean so much to me. So thank you, Dustin, for organizing this.
Thank you, Anne. And we did write the endings essay, I will say, and we were going to work on another one, but that is out there. AWP published it, and there's a paywall, but like, send me an email and I'll totally send it to you. I hope there are no AWP reps here. But yeah, I took that. Wendell was such a great teacher of endings. He had a lesson, like these, like 10 different kind of endings, and we expanded it to like 17 different species of endings, and we had a lot of fun with that. But anyway, he was so good at it, right? I remember him saying we were like, he was a vulture. He would circle his endings until he found it and swoop down on it. Anyway, thank you, Anne. Again, this is so great. I should move things along, although like this group of people, I could go for hours, but I know you can't. Like, you all have things to do, and so onward to Misha Rai. So Misha Rai is the Kenyon Review Fellow in Prose. Her work has received support from the Whiting Foundation, the U Cross Foundation, McDowell, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Dana Award in the novel category. She was born in Sonipat, Haryana, and brought up in India. Thank you, Misha. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Dustin, and Brad, thank you for reaching out. Lawrence, it's so good to see you in all these faces. I'm so glad that I get to be a part of this. And I think I'm going to start with my story, my Wendell story first, actually, as opposed to reading, and I hope that's all right. Part of this has to do with the fact that I sometimes I'm still suspicious about how I got into the program, and I'll tell you the story. This was my third year of applying to the MFA programs. In the first year, there had been nothing. The second year, I'd gotten waitlisted. And the third year, I was waiting around. And one day I just thought, I'm just going to call these programs. And I started calling, and nobody picked up. Nobody picked up. It was voicemail, etc. And I called the number, the Bowling Green number. I don't even know if I had his office number. And I just called a random number, and this man picks up. And I was like, hi. The most awkward conversation ensues. At this point, and I ask him, I'm like, he's like, we're making decisions, and I'm like, my name, I tell him my name, etc. He's like, I think you're on the wait list. I was like, could you push me up to the top of the wait list? I'm telling him, I'm like, from India, and this is desperate, please let me come to this program. And he's so embarrassed. He's like, I don't think I can, we went back and forth for 10 minutes, and then I sort of was like, just please let me come to this program. That's right, Lawrence. I have no idea. I really do think I got in because of that phone call. If I was on that wait list, I feel like he he just pitied me. He thought, this girl from India is calling me in the middle of the night. Anyways, that's my Wendell story. And then of course I met him. I got there, I had technique classes with him and workshop with Lawrence. And I think that both of you were just, you've both been, I mean, you changed my life basically. If I hadn't come to Bowling Green, I don't know what I would have been doing. So I feel so grateful to be here to celebrate him. And I can't stop thinking about the amount of soda Wendell drank. For some reason, that's the thing that's in my head all the time. I just remember him sitting down and the can would open and then the class would get started. So those are my memories of, I mean, I have so many memories, but I've picked those. I'm going to read the first few pages of the last story in the collection. And I chose that because I just thought, you know, if you haven't read the collection, you should see what the end looks like. And I'm also just going to read the first few pages. The story is called The Saddest Story He Ever Told. So we get to the point where he starts telling the story and then I'm going to stop. So hopefully you're going to be interested and want to read that. So here's the story. The saddest story he ever tells. When he pulled up that Friday night in December, I met him at the main entrance of my building, Winton Place, a high-rise condo overlooking Lake Erie. He had been an older student in my Thursday night interpersonal communication course, had a day job somewhere around Public Square, and asked me out just after the final examination. I laughed when he begged me to not disconfirm him. He added, I tell a mean story. By mean, I said, do you mean a good story or an unkind story? I was impressed, but I was so taken, I wasn't impressed, but I was so taken by his small hands nervously petting his maroon necktie that I surrendered my phone number without replying. His hands were lovely, almost divine, childlike, the way you see baby Christ's hands clutching his mother's neck in Renaissance paintings. I slid beside him in his soul. The car mice drive-in ads, one perfectly sized for mice, so small the faux fur fox collar of my coat touched his ear. The whole 10 seconds in transit across the parking lot to Pier W, he kept brushing 4 hairs away from his ear canal. Worth the price of the cramped car ride since it afforded me a chance to look closely at his lovely hands, his slim fingers, pink oval fingernails, cuticles like small white moons, nail ends slivers of opalescence, expertly filed. I wonder why he'd chosen Pier W, a restaurant only a minute's walk across the parking lot from Winton Place. I supposed it was easy enough for him to Google me, my condo. I'd gotten the down payment for it with help from my parents. They understood when I told them I needed a place on a higher floor, 26 stories up. I had this fear of looking up, like vertigo in reverse. I needed to look down, though so high above things and alone. I felt a little like Rapunzel without the witch Dame Gothel for company. After a while, the condo was a source of amusement for my mother. She'd call me Zell, and I called her Dame. I felt the words made us closer. I was an only child, and it had been difficult for us both when I moved away from home. We're here, I laughed, expecting him to be surprised by the absurdly short ride, but he wasn't. Safe and sound, he said, like he knew all along where I lived in relation to the restaurant. Pier W sat atop a raw concrete pedestal, the restaurant itself cantilevered high over Lake Erie, looking back on downtown Cleveland, building shaped like the head of the extraterrestrial in Spielberg's film. The sun had set by the time we were seated. Out our window, I watched the city, its skyscrapers not nearly as threatening as walking downtown to my regular PR job at WJW-TV. The Key Tower, Terminal Tower, and Tower on Public Square each appeared like a mountain of light hovering in the dark, without foothills, floating above its own liquid reflection in the rippling lake water. My Zell self wondered why Cleveland's tallest buildings came to be known as towers. By the time the waiter brought the wine list, I was searching for an icebreaker, though my date appeared not to be. Only his hands showed, holding the list at his face. Rude, I thought, but less so because of his fascinating hands, though after a time I grew so annoyed, I nearly asked him outright why his hands were so small. Was he an anomaly of aging, betrayed only by his hands? In fact, so young, he may not be old enough to drink wine. I studied my own hands, slender, fingers perhaps a little long, yet still larger than his. In the pinky of my left hand, I developed a trigger finger. Mornings when I tried to bend it, there was this little hitch I had to press through before I could curl my pinky fully. Because of it, my left pinky leaned out a little from other fingers, like a poorly executed live long and prosper sign made by Mr. Spock. I dreaded my errant little digits, something I felt inherited from my mother, whose arthritic hands had begun to curl and look like lobster claws. I Googled my willful finger one wine-spirited evening, high in my Rapunzel's nest, finding that a leaning pinky meant one resented her mother, though I could not think why, until the web page, I suppose as web pages do, also said the owner of a leaning pinky would not be aware of such maternal resentment. I poured another glass of wine to celebrate the epiphany. Other than being tiny, my date's hand seemed perfect. I dated men with huge hands, stubby fat finger hands, hands with nails bitten down to nubs, hands seeming without knuckles, hands with large knotty knuckles. Each, I was certain, meant some infirmity, some defect of personality. Each no second date, each a dead end. But his hands were different, so small and surreal, they seemed to exaggerate everything around them. What's this mean story you mentioned telling? Cabernet, he asked. Fine, but what about that story? He set the wine list aside and said, how about a bottle of poetry by Cliff Lead from the Stag's Leap District? I consulted my wine list. That's $300 a bottle, I said. Oh, well, since you insist. When the waiter arrived, he ordered instead the $4.95 a glass Cabernet Private Reserve, though I couldn't imagine how private or reserved it could be since a majority of diners had glasses of it sitting at their tables. We waited for the cheap wine. Oh, he said suddenly, that story. He leaned forward. His shirt cuffs drew up into his dark, cavernous coat sleeves, exposing his wrists, so delicate. My mother. I knew it. A story of the Jesus baby's mother. Our glasses of wine arrived. I smiled as he told me about what a lovely woman his mother was. Short with close-cropped carmine-colored hair, like wine, he said, taking the huge blue goblet lightly in the palm of one hand, swirling the Cabernet, then setting it back without drinking. I started to settle in for a long date, a man and his mother. I fought hard to not enter the disconfirmation zone. Thank you.
Thanks, Misha. And yes, here's the sales. Like, wait until you hear that sad story, the saddest story. All right, so our last reader is going to be Matt Bell. Matt Bell's next novel, Appleseed, is forthcoming from Custom House in July 2021. His craft book, Refused to be Done, a guide to novel revision, will follow in early 2022 from Soho Press. He is also the author of the novel Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, which is on the governor's bookshelf. And it's been on the news lately, by the way, as well as the short story collection, A Tree or a Person or a Wall, a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate 2, and several other titles. A native of Michigan, he teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. He graduated from BGSU in 2010. That's the Michigan governor, by the way, where Matt and I are both from Michigan. And for some reason, I assume that's all of our governors, even though we don't live anywhere near Michigan anymore. Matt, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Thank you to everybody who read tonight. Dustin, I don't know if Dustin would want me to tell you this, but he was a little worried he might burst into tears at some point in this evening. And so he wanted to go first to get out of the way. I'm like, that's cool. We'll get that thing out of the way early and then I'll be good by the end. And now I feel very full of all this sort of remembrance and Wendell's words. I'll just say two things really quickly and then I'll read so we can end with Wendell's words. I spent the last couple of years as the director of creative writing at my school, and my second year at Bowling Green, Wendell took over as director. And I was his assistant, which Dustin had been the year before. And it was 2009, so it was the last economic crisis, and it kind of looked like everything in the program was going to get cut. And Wendell was like pretty calm about it. They were like going to cut TA funding and the visiting writers, the reading series and the visiting writer position and all this stuff. And Wendell's like, it'll be okay, you know? And he just kept going to meetings and advocating for us. And things would keep getting like one back. He'd sort of get it. And at the end of the year, he's like, we didn't quite get everything. I'm like, well, what didn't we get? He's like, you're all going to have to pay for parking from now on. So he had fought this like huge sort of economic battle on our behalves. And as far as I know, the class that went after us, you had to buy your own like $79 parking pass. And I'm sorry, but you got everything else. And I feel like that's a pretty huge win. Just quietly, humbly doing that sort of work behind the scenes on our behalf, which of course made so much possible for all of us. And then the other thing I'll just sort of end with is right after I graduated, I lived in Ann Arbor, so it's about an hour away. And I came down to have lunch with Wendell, and we met at the Panera, I think, in Bowling Green. And Wendell was already there, just sitting at his table, being Wendell. And I kind of sat down, and as soon as I sat down, he looked at me and he just said, you know, you've been my student, the only way I've ever known you, and now we have to find out if we're going to be friends. And then he laughed. He's like, let's begin. And I'd like to think that we did that, and that we all did that, and that's wonderful. I'm going to read just the beginning scene of a story called Two Dimes, which I picked partly because I like the way the scene ends, which feels like a nice place to finish. And I also think it has sort of Wendell's sort of energy or sense of humor sort of way. It's very fast in a way that works really well. It's Two Dimes. Even ill, his mother was a kind woman, and for a time her kindness was part of her illness. The worst of it, a $5,000 draft she gave to a man who told her his house had burned clean to the ground. The house never existed. Man vanished. So did her money. I felt sorry for him, she told her son on the telephone, and later, oh my God, his name, I don't remember. And after that, when she briefly realized the man had swindled her, I'm going to get it back. What, her son groaned, the money? No, stupid, she replied, my life. The weekend after she lost the $5,000, he completed the 6-hour drive to her small 2-bedroom house in McKeesport. It rained the whole way on the interstate. His radio chattered nervously. Tires from cars ahead of him threw an inky black liquid onto his headlights. He stopped several times at roadside rests to wipe them off, but the black water kept coating them. So when he pulled into her drive, he felt blinded by the road, looking into relative darkness most of the way. She snapped on the porch light, her robed figure hovering behind the mesh screen door. His eyes ached, head throbbed, and when he stepped into the living room, she brought the full force of 3 new lamps to bear. He stuck the side of one hand to his brow, squinting at her, eyes adjusting a bit more to the glare. All 3 lamps were antique brass with frosted globes depicting 3 stages of young Abraham Lincoln's life. One in his birth cabin etched Hodgenville, Kentucky. Another, his wielding an axe over a sizable length of timber, reading Rail Splitter. And the third, his handing 2 pennies to a woman possessing a surprised and approving smile. Honest Abe, of course. He looked for other obvious loot in the living room, laughing a little with relief when he saw a new purchase on the telephone stand, special order embossed stationery, Keep the Faith, $100 plus $10.95 shipping and handling. Handling by whom? And what had these so-called handlers thought about what she'd had it embossed with? When his mother entered the room, she sat on the sofa, smiling sweetly, hands placed placidly in her lap, knees together, cap showing white a little above the surface of the coffee table. He winced, seeing opals in all settings imaginable scattered over the coffee table, carelessly as stones in a desert. When he leaned over to inspect the stones, she was right at his elbow, whispering in his ear, "They change with my moods." She wrung her hands, plucked up a particularly brilliant green-blue stone set in a silver brooch. When he saw the bill for the lot underneath, he panicked. $2,597, including fees for inscriptions and all the settings. Stone love, some in script so minuscule he could scarcely read it. But he knew her kind of words, that kind of faith, her kind of faith. "We can't afford all this stuff," he told her. He scooped up the opals and receipts off the coffee table and put them in his coat pockets. "What are we going to do?" She got up from the sofa, came over to him, and leaned in so close he could feel the wisp of her breath on his cheek. "Never mind that." She patted his coat pocket. "You ever find those 2 dimes? She silenced him, knocked him back, while the memory of 2 lost dimes piled in his mind. He was 9 years old. She'd given him 2 nice new dimes for ice cream, a miracle, since they'd never had that kind of money to spare. She asked him to go a block over and buy orange push-ups for the both of them. As he exited the apartment complex, he could hear the tinny, reverberant bells of the ice cream truck going through the complex. He remembered heading for the sound. He spotted the truck, approached it, then spotted Nicky, a fat kid with a foul odor and elephant skin elbows, one of those kids with an evil, charismatic smirk, better suited to Sean Connery's James Bond than a fat kid. Once he'd heard Nicky rob another kid while he stood waiting for the ice cream truck, a whole quarter. So when Nicky walked up, he turned his back to the fat boy and popped the 2 dimes in his mouth. "Hey, punk," Nicky said, "what have you got in your mouth?" He turned to face his nemesis, but before he could reply, his panic reflex forced him to swallow both dimes. Nicky stared at him with like panic, a queer expression of wonder and fear. And then Nicky fled, the ice cream truck rolled up, and the driver leaned out the little window. "What'll it be, kid?" the driver asked, but had already taken off, across the street and into the honeycomb of apartments. How could he explain the incident to his mother? He resolved to tell her any story except the awkward truth. Perhaps he'd say how the ice cream truck nearly careened into a nearby hydrant, and in his excitement, the dimes flew out of his fist and vanished into a sewer grating. Or how he saw a man with no legs sitting squarely on the cement holding a sign, "Poor and Blind," and how out of compassion he dropped the 2 dimes into his cup. But when he came into the apartment, when he saw her waiting patiently for her orange push-up, kindness blooming from her smile, he couldn't help himself. "I accidentally swallowed them," he told her. She laughed, then briefly covered her mouth with a hand. "Well, son," she said, "why did you put them in your mouth in the first place?" "I don't know," he said, thinking not so much about his reason for putting the 2 dimes there, since that was painfully apparent to him, but thinking how he might die of dime poisoning or some such thing. "I'm going to die, Mom, aren't I?" he added, which also struck him as a splendid diversionary question to get her feeling sorry for him. "You're not going to die," she replied. "Those dimes will go right through you and end up, you know, there. Yes, you must keep checking for them." For a time, he undertook the awful task of searching for the dimes. He never found them. He swallowed once just thinking about the dimes after all this time, a reflex he'd come to expect over the years, but he swallowed harder when he noticed his mother's new pipe organ, tucked unobtrusively in a far corner of the small living room, and swallowed twice more when he finally got her to show him the bill for $15,196 with tax, special freight, handling, the 10-year extended in-home tuning and warranty. He scanned the bill feverishly. "We have to return this," he said. She went over to the organ, flipped up the keyboard cover, and began to hammer out Amazing Grace, complete with vocal accompaniment that saved a wretch like me, though he scarcely attended to the tune, her favorite sense, as she declared mid-note, muscle under her left eye quivering, "Who needs another song when one has this one?" Thank you.